Good morning. Thank you for joining today's webinar on Loggly 3.0, Better Together Log Analysis and Monitoring. Loggly 3.0 is connecting the dots for all the DevOps operations. With Loggly 3.0, you can monitor the operations of your applications and the infrastructure using our charts and dashboards. And also, you can drill down into more details using our log analysis capabilities. And last but not least, you can also use our GitHub integration to look at the code and fix the code in a very fast fashion. Today, we have a full agenda. We will start with a panel, then we will go on with the panel for maybe 35 or 40 minutes, and then we'll go into a demo of Loggly 3.0 for those who haven't seen the product yet or want to know a little bit more detail about it. And then we'll open up for Q&A. And in the meantime, if you have any questions, please feel free to just enter the questions into the Q&A panel. I, as the moderator, will monitor that panel and see what we can do. But mostly, we will address the questions at the end of this presentation. I want to introduce you to the people around me today. First of all, my name is Desmond Chan. I am part of the product marketing team here at Loggly, and I have worked for various big data companies before. And coming to Loggly, is really enjoyable to work on the log management and monitoring space. And for the panelist, for most of you expect Mike Julian, our expert in monitoring, to join. Unfortunately, and we apologize for this, Mike has a personal emergency last minute and he cannot join us. But fortunately, we have invited our own co-founder and chief search officer to join the panel. He will be able to give you his vision and also his insights on the whole topic today. And also joining us is our senior product manager, Pranay Kamat, who has been spearheading the whole Loggly 3.0 release. So without further ado, let's start with the panel. First of all, our founder and chief search officer, John Gifford. John, thank you so much for joining. I know that you have been with various search companies, and this is a company that you started yourself. And you have tremendous experience in building large systems and search systems. What triggered you to start a company in log management, and what's your vision?
So, yeah, I have about 20 years experience of working just purely in search at a bunch of different companies, starting at LookSmart, and then moving to Technorati, which was blog search, and then Scout Labs, which was kind of social media search for marketers, and then Loggly. And what kind of was consistent across all of that was I was dealing with systems, search systems that basically required the use of hundreds and hundreds of machines and hundreds of instances of applications running on those machines. And in order to be able to say with any kind of degree of certainty that things were working, you have to be able to see what is going on those machines. And so sort of in each system I worked on, I was creating the equivalent of Loggly, if you like, for those systems, and they were always sort of custom monitoring systems built using basically every technology we had available to us. So some were written in Perl, some were written in Java, some were written in I think the very early ones would have been written in Bash and Orc and grep and all of those things that anyone who's been working on Unix systems is sort of intimately familiar with. So what basically happened was that around the time we started the company, it had become clear that search technology itself was capable of being used to build those systems. Up until that point, it was always kind of too expensive or not flexible enough or just too much work to do it. And, we started the company before Elasticsearch existed. We started the company before Solar Cloud really got going. So it seemed like a good opportunity to use search to solve a problem that everyone running big systems has. And so it was kind of scratching an itch in the sense that I'd always had to build these systems, but it was scratching that itch with a technology that I was intimately familiar with.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And you started with logging. I mean, like you said that with your background and everything, it just makes sense to go into logging. But today we're also talking about monitoring, right? Like, we are advocating that these two go hand in hand. And you started with logging. Why not monitoring?
So I think it's probably just battle scars. So all of the systems that I'd built up to that point had some element of monitoring in them, right? You obviously want to know that every application is up and running. You obviously need to have sort of data on how many queries a second you're processing or how much RAM is being used or all of those kind of things, right? You need that to be able to say, yeah, things are happy, or that part of the system is getting overloaded, we need more resources, or whatever. But that's only useful up to the point where, a major fault exists in the system. And at that point, it's not enough to simply say it's broken, right? Or this part of the system is broken or whatever. You have to actually be able to explain why that happened. And so in my experience, you can kind of Siamese some monitoring into logging, right? And we actually have been doing this with our own systems here for the lifetime of the company. So we've always had this idea that you can do some amount of internal monitoring of the applications direct from the application. But that the really tricky situations are when there is a failure, and you really need to be able to understand what that failure is. And so that's kind of why we started with logging. Another reason is that less of an issue for us, but in a lot of these other systems, particularly where you're doing, like we did at LookSmart, we did sort of web scale search on the web, actually. I believe we had the third largest index in the world back in sort of 2000-ish, which these days seems kind of tiny. I think it was 4 billion or 6 billion documents, which
Probably generates that much today. Every day. I wish.
in there, I mean, dealing with 4 billion. But anyway, point being, that in that system, what mattered was being able to understand query flow. The query stream, right? So you can imagine if you're solving that problem today, like Google are and Bing and all of those guys, what you actually want to see is not that the system's performing okay. What you actually want to see is the query stream and the change in behavior. And you can see this in tools like Google Trends, where they can show you how often people are searching for, to take a recent example, Puerto Rico. Right. Guarantee you, there's been a massive spike in Google search for Puerto Rico. So that kind of data is not super readily available in monitoring. It's got to come from the logs. And when you are looking at how effective your system is at solving your customers' problems, right? So in the search space, it is show me the best web pages out there or best social media for Puerto Rico. You've got to be able to track not just the fact that the query existed, but the user behavior on the resulting page, right? So you want to see that the topmost item actually got the most clicks. And if it didn't, you want to adjust your relevancy ranking to move things around to get the best results. So that kind of stuff is not something you can super easily do with monitoring. I mean, you can, but then your monitoring becomes so verbose and so kind of intricate that, arguably it's not really monitoring anymore. It's just logging.
That brings up a very good question, actually. We just take it for granted that people understand what log analysis is, what monitoring is. How about, just that we tell the audience what, in our perspective, monitoring, what does that mean?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, for me, like I said, there are certain elements of monitoring that we have always done in our system, using our system. And those are, you can think of it as, easiest way to think of it is homegrown instrumentation of your code, right? So, for example, we have a pipeline that accepts data from our customers and runs it through various cleansing and parsing and indexing stages, right? Now, all along that pipeline, we are tracking the performance of the system, both in terms of the amount of throughput. So, how are we doing 100,000 or 150,000 events per second through the pipeline, or 200,000, right? We can see that directly just because we have counters in the application. Now, arguably, you could do this through JMX. We chose not to. We're just doing it straight through logging. There's a bunch of different mechanisms, but the important point is that through our own instrumentation, we can get a specific view, one that's tailored to what we need to know about what's actually going on in the system. That's one side of monitoring, in my opinion. The other side is the stuff that is perhaps more familiar to most people, which is things like Collect-D and tools like that, where you're actually gathering information on a regular basis about sort of the fundamental, either hardware or operating system level performance. So if you look at system load, for example, on a Unix system, it's just a bunch, ultimately it's just a bunch of counters sitting in /proc, and all the monitoring does is go and get those counters periodically and computes the difference and says, here's my system load for the last 1 minute, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or 15. And so that kind of monitoring where there are already well trusted, well understood sort of daemon processes that just sit there tracking those counters, tracking what is going on at the operating system or even hardware level, and then kind of emitting them through well-known protocols, is something that's been around, again, basically forever. And those are the things that, those are the kinds of data that people are used to thinking of as monitoring. And those are incredibly useful too. So I think that when you think of monitoring, there's at least those two components. I'm sure, Road, if we talk hard enough, we come up with more, but those are the big ones, I think. And, we know that a lot of our customers are already doing the first. We do it. We've been telling people how to do it for a long time. We see it in the data that our customers are sending us. So we know that that's actually a pretty common way to monitor. And the nice thing about it is that it gives you the ability as the developer or as the development team to actually monitor the things that matter to you, right? So to give you an example, a lot of applications are very resource heavy on one resource. So maybe they're very CPU bound, maybe they're very IO bound. In that case, monitoring the things that they're not resource heavy on might make you feel kind of warm and fuzzy, but it's not really telling you anything. That's right.
Yeah.
So by sort of supporting this idea that, essentially any numeric sort of periodic data can be treated as monitoring data, which is what we're talking about here. You get to, as the developer, you get to be able to say, this thing is important, that thing is not. And then you can tailor that data that you ship to us to specifically target the areas that matter to you. And that will change over time. Like all systems evolve. And something that was crucially important when you were first starting up the system, because maybe it was an area where you didn't have a whole lot of confidence or where you knew that there was a high risk, becomes less important over time as you work on that part of the code base and make it more reliable and make it less of a risk and improve the performance. So, I think that's the other thing to bear in mind is that with all monitoring, all kind of internal monitoring rather of your applications, it will evolve over time.
Right. Yeah, like you said, everything evolves over time. That we used to have a 3-tier application, the web tier, the application tier, and then the database tier. And now we're all talking about modern application architecture with microservices and so on, right? So with the new modern architecture, you actually mentioned before in our previous conversations, code is code, right? And so on. Just want to hear from your perspective, how does that change for log management or monitoring?
So I think there's a couple different aspects to this. The first is that, literally code is just code. Logging is just code. It runs in your application and you need to kind of be aware of what the implications of that are. So, I think a lot of people are a little sort of afraid of putting a huge amount of logging in their code. And I think that is in part justified. But I think that in general, the fear is not based on data. I mean, and what I mean by that is, it's not uncommon at all for a developer to say, oh, well, I don't want to log that because it'll be too much data. The logs will explode. Without actually having run the experiment to see whether they will, right? Or without having run the experiment to see whether their logging framework imposes any significant performance penalty on their application. Now, there's a really simple example of this, I think, that is if you have a single-threaded web server and you're logging through using a REST API, which you can do with us, for example, and the REST endpoint you're using to log is slow, then yeah, your application is going to hurt, right? But you shouldn't think of that as a logging issue in the sense that if you have any other external REST-based requests that can be done asynchronously, you're probably already doing them asynchronously. So why should logging be different, right? So I think that the fear component is one where I think, with a little bit of thought, most good engineers can find ways to reduce. You probably cannot eliminate logging overhead, but you can certainly reduce it to a point where it just doesn't matter. I think the other thing about this is that there's what's the right way to put this? I think that you need to be really careful. So, for example, in our instrumentation code that we use through our pipeline, we put a lot of thought into how to make it as lightweight as possible. And the reason for that is that we could see the value in it, but we didn't want to have endless debates about whether we should use it or not, right? So if we built it in a way that made it so cheap, like in the 50s, they were talking about nuclear power making electricity too cheap to meter. That's kind of where you want to be with logging um, and with instrumentation. You want to make sure that you spend the time to make sure that it really is kind of too cheap to worry about.
That's good insight. So, on the same topic, we're focused on DevOps teams, right? And logging, monitoring, and I think their goal is to really make sure that everything's working right in their environment. Where do you see them, fail, quote unquote, right?
Yeah, so I think that in my experience, and I've worked on a lot of teams over a long time period, too long to tell people. I think the biggest failure, the biggest kind of disconnect is where, the development team is divorced from the operation team entirely, right? And there are really good reasons to do that for some software development. Like the example, I think we talked about this yesterday. If I'm writing an aviation, if I'm writing a flight control module for a 747 there, I just aged myself, for a Dreamliner. If I'm building an aviation component for the Dreamliner, and I know that there are 5 other teams working, or 4 other teams working on it as well, and that those systems will all run in parallel, there'll be a vote, and the consensus will control what the plane does, then a very heavy silo makes a lot of sense, because what you don't want is to kind of cross-pollinate the other teams with bad ideas, right? Or bias or whatever. So in that case, it's a good idea. But those are rare, I think you'll find in most modern software development environments. You don't have the luxury of having 5 teams all working on the same problem. So, right. In most cases, the team that is developing the code is kind of trying to get it out as quickly as they can and move on to the next sprint, whatever methodology you use. But they're trying to get it done and move on to their next task. And as developers, their next task is development. And I think what I've seen is that if that team just kind of throws it over a wall, and the ops team then has to install it, run it, monitor it, and report bugs, then what ends up happening is you have this kind of disconnect between the two teams. And I've seen this very frequently, where ops will report a bug, engineering will say, well, we're not going to get to that for another 2 weeks or 2 months or 2 years, right? And so ops have no kind of recourse but to kind of band-aid something around it, which, frequently is just, oh, we'll just cron restart.
Right.
I'm sure everyone has kind of had that experience on both sides of the equation. So the disconnect there is essentially that by creating this wall, by saying that engineering's job is to ship code and operations' job is to run it, you kind of create a barrier that is very hard to kind of get through, right? And so, one of the things that I have pretty much always done in my career is tried very, very, very hard to stop that wall being created, or if it was created outside of my control, and find ways to kind of break it down, and provide me as a developer access to the data that can tell me what's really going on in production, right? And it's, particularly when you work in systems as large as the systems that I've worked on, unless you work for, Google or Amazon or a Fortune 500 company, you don't have the resources to set up a QA environment that exactly matches production, right?
Mhm.
So the best test, and like disturbingly frequently the first test of whether something you've just done works, is when it goes into production.
Right.
And at that point, if you don't have visibility into the things that you as an engineer know that you should be watching, then you're just in for a world of hurt.
That makes sense. I think the whole premise for LogMeIn 3.0 is to connect the dots, to break the silos, to make sure that everybody has access to all the information that they need for any sort of like troubleshooting or operational issues. So, well, Pranay, you're here with us as well. You have been spearheading the LogMeIn 3.0 product. And so just, you have talked to a lot of customers. How do they do it right now? How do they monitor and, do log analysis at the same time?
So what we have heard from most of our customers is something that I think John touched upon, Rick, is like, you look at it like more like Siamese thing, where they do both of these things either together or, as different teams. So the most common workflow that we have heard is that, hey, they set up alerts, in Loggly or in other monitoring tools like Datadog or SignalFX. And when something happens, they get alerted. Once that happens, they have to go dig up the why. Why did it happen? Where has it happened? What are all the different things that are affected? And that's when they jump into Loggly and they use the Loggly search to look into the different log events. And the most successful customers are those who have actually had, implemented all their different parts throughout their stack, and they're sending all the logs. So, if you only send something which is like your Apache logs, or if you only send your Docker logs, that doesn't give them the complete picture where when they're trying to find the why behind the what. So that's what we have seen. The kind of the combination of different tools, the combination of different log sources, throughout their stack. That's when they really see the complete value and kind of seeing the big picture.
Right. So I think the key here is that the customers, they're using disparate tools for, the, for going at the same thing, and they have to switch back and forth. What are the disadvantages of that? I mean, like panelists, please feel free to just chime in however way. Yeah.
So, I mean, the biggest disadvantage is, as anyone who's ever used two tools to kind of solve related problems, the biggest problem is just correlating the two, right? So it's fine to have a monitoring system that will tell you that some part of your system is overheating. Maybe it's using more CPU than it was. Maybe like the I/O has gone through the roof. That's all great. Like, you can see it in your monitoring system. You can see the time range. And then you have to kind of somehow transfer that to some other tool, right?
Mhm.
Which may have is almost certain to have a different UI. It's almost can occasionally have a UI that makes it impossible for you to narrow down the time range, to stick with the really simple example. And that, may not even have the ability to kind of narrow down enough to get to the part to get to the appropriate logs that will sort of identify the problem. So I think this is probably the biggest problem with using multiple tools. It's not to say that the individual tool itself is not a good tool, but the fact that you're using different tools and there's no direct communication between the two just makes things harder. And anytime, and anyone who's been in operations for any amount of time will tell you this. Anytime there's a manual step,
Right.
there's room for error. That's right. So you could end up looking at exactly the wrong time period and going, I don't understand why we got alerted. Because maybe you're looking at yesterday instead of today, or maybe you're looking at 9 to 10 a.m. rather than 8 to 9, or maybe one system uses UTC and the other uses local. And you're just, so, and all of those things kind of combine together to make manual error a real issue.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. So in terms of reducing the human error, combining everything, Pranay, what do you think that Loggly 3.0 does best in that?
I think going back to the whole connected dots, right? With Loggly 3.0, we make it much easier for you to actually look at your logs and metrics together, because that's when you have, real value of getting the complete view of what's going on in your system. And we have heard from some customers where they went back, they were using tools like New Relic, Datadog, Loggly, and then they have made sure that when they're sending their logs in, they capture as much detail as possible, on the different metrics as JSON fields. They went and re-instrumented everything, and now they are able to create more complex charts in Loggly using Loggly 3.0, which was not possible earlier. But that kind of speeds up the whole idea when they are actually troubleshooting something. Now they are able to connect these disparate data sources and look at what's common, and find those correlations. And that's what the real power of Loggly 3.0 is. And now with 3.0, you also get the power of having that Loggly is connected well with the DevOps ecosystem. So you have these different tools that you use, whether it is Jira for ticket tracking, whether it is GitHub where you have your source code, and you want to match your exceptions with your source code. With Loggly 3.0, that's possible, and that's how that helps developers kind of speed up things without having to worry about switching context between different tools.
That's great. I can't wait to see the product. One more question. Like you mentioned GitHub integration. What do we have in store for the customers in terms of GitHub integration?
So with GitHub integration is something that we launched as part of Loggly 3.0, and what the main thing is that if you ask any developer, there's always been a situation where they have been called in to troubleshoot and look at issues that they haven't written, like the code that they haven't written, and suddenly there's an escalation and they need to look into. So the first thing is they're trying to find out, oh, here's an exception. Which file is this? Who made this change? When was this change made? And then and this needs to be forwarded to the right person who can then fix that issue. With GitHub integration now, we make it much easier for developers to connect that. From when you look at those exceptions in the logs, you can immediately spot, what's the source code, and we pull it. You don't have to go to GitHub. You can see that source code right inside Loggly. Then you can look at the the commit history for different files, and then you can be like, aha, here's the change. Maybe this is what caused the issue. And then if you're using Jira as a ticket tracking system, you can make sure that this issue gets reported and then to the right person.
Great. Yeah, it facilitates the whole communication and collaboration chain. That's great. So, without further ado, I'm sure that people are so eager to look at the Loggly 3.0 demo. So Pranay, let me just make you the presenter, and then so that you can show the product to our customers here.
So I'm sharing my screen here, and for those of you who are already familiar with Loggly and have been using Loggly for a while, we can see like this is a completely different look and feel of the product with much more significant improvements in the charts and dashboard area. For those who are new to Loggly, you can see that Loggly now allows you to create complex dashboards with complex charts, and plot logs and metrics together in the same dashboard. So here are a few dashboards that I had just created for a demo purpose, and you can see like if you have AWS based systems, you can monitor all different kinds of things. You can plot, you can check the production errors by host. You can look at different SQL execution times, or if you're using ELB, then you can monitor what's the trend like for the different status scores throughout the day. I have here a sample dashboard with some of the CloudWatch metrics, and you can see how this is useful, where you have now plotted like dashboards with charts that comprise of different types of different categories. So some of you who may be AWS customers can see charts in AWS itself, the CloudWatch metrics. But the real value is when you want to actually correlate with your other parts of the stack, non-AWS parts. Then that's where you can create those charts and put it on a single dashboard inside Loggly. Now, here you have, let's say on this dashboard, you have charts of different time ranges. Some are for the last 1 hour, one is for 57 days, or the last 7 days. Imagine yourself to be a DevOps person who walks into the office in the morning and you look at a big screen and you see something happened in the last 10 minutes. There's a big spike in errors on a particular server, and quickly you want to zoom in your entire system and get a sense of what's going on in the 10 system. So you don't have to actually go and change the time range for each chart. You can quickly pick the time picker right here. If you say last 10 minutes, you will see that all the charts actually now refresh to show what's going on in the last 10 minutes. We already heard from a lot of customers, this is how this is useful for them, because this speeds up the whole task of quickly identifying, where the fire is, what are the different systems that are affected. If you click on this icon here, it goes into the edit mode where you can actually look at the different charts, and you can add new charts here easily by, you can just find something. So let's say I have to find session action, and it adds this chart. So if you are to do, let's say, different charts that you want to just rearrange, and they quickly go there. So let's cancel this out. Switch. Okay. Go back to this one. So the whole idea being that, we have made it much easier for you to find and add charts to a dashboard. You can easily drag and rearrange them however you want. You can vertically and horizontally resize them so that you can customize the look and feel of your dashboard. And then you're introduced, a permissions model, which makes it easier for you to decide, who can view your dashboard and who can edit. Often we have heard from customers where if you are like an admin or a senior power user in the account, you create these complex charts. You don't want others to muck it up, but you want to make sure that you share them with others in the team. This is where, the permissions model plays an important role. You can set them to saying that the team can view them, but they can't edit. So that way everybody can use that dashboard, but you don't have to worry about someone messing it up. Often we hear that when you're troubleshooting, you may not be the right person who has the full picture of what's going on. And, you find it useful to actually share a quick screenshot to, someone in your team or HipChat or Slack on what's going on and asking for help. So you made it easier now for you to take the screenshot. You can just click on this export icon here. And you can see that, we take a full full image, for the dashboard. You don't have to worry about resizing your dashboard or your screen to take that image. So now you can quickly take this and share it over HipChat and Slack with your team while you're trying to diagnose something. Another interesting thing that we have introduced as part of 3.0 is the full screen mode. So we have made it optimal for you to actually project this on big screens, because we have seen a lot of our customers do that. So there's more, less white space, more data ink, and you can optimally present this on large screens in your office spaces. Now, some of the things is, once you see a trend, you want to maybe go and change the underlying query. So let me click on this chart here. It goes into the charts library. And you can see how we have now an improved, this is a completely new capability as part of 3.0, where you can actually edit the controls and the underlying query for the chart. So you can, specify what we change the type of chart. You can name the series. You can apply, series level source group controls, which means you can actually plot maybe one series showing the number of errors on your production account versus the number of errors on your in your staging and QA. So that way you can compare, how the different accounts are working. Or if you want to compare two production servers, you can now do that on a single chart. What's also useful is that once you create these charts and you're monitoring them, you can also share a unique link to your teammates via HipChat or Slack. So the link that you see here in the URL here is actually a permalink to those specific charts or dashboards. So if you were to just click this by like a copy link feature, click this and it'll copy to your clipboard, and then you can share it easily with others in your team when you spot something interesting and you want to bring it to their attention. So when they click on that link, they'll see that we recreate the exact same view, so that, you don't have to worry about pointing out things like, this is what I saw, versus they see something different.
And if I can just jump in quickly. So we've been using 3.0 for our production monitoring, and we use this feature a lot. So HipChat, our HipChat is riddled with these links to dashboards now. What previously was kind of difficult to do. We used to have to do a screen grab or whatever. Now we just share the URL and everyone can tell you exactly what we're seeing.
Yeah, we're eating our own dog food and working very well for our own system. That's great. Yeah.
So now, so I think as you can see, like, as John mentioned, this is something that, we have started, using heavily 3.0 ourselves to across the board for, monitoring our own systems, because we see that 3.0 makes it much easier for you to not only create and visualize chart, but also share it with your teammates. Um, one of the things that, we have heard a lot of positive feedback about in 3.0 is the ability to customize individual data series. So now you can actually not just have like a global search or a global filter that applies to all the series in this chart. You can actually apply, custom filters at individual series levels. So let's say you had here a series one load balancer one, and you want to filter it for tag, say US or UK, and then the second one you want to actually filter it on some other tag. You can do that. Now you can create. If you in the past with Logly, if you had multiple charts, we have already heard from customers where they have combined those in a single chart. Another interesting thing that we have launched into as part of 3.0 is the time shift capability. So we find time shift to be a very powerful use case where you want to compare how a metric is doing compared to itself in a different time period. For example, let's say you had a maintenance window over the weekend, and you want to see whether that has caused the number of errors on a particular server to go down after that. You can easily do that by clicking on this time shift icon here, which will add another time series and in a different time period. So here it's minus 1 day. I can change it to a week. And now you can see how this allows you to quickly capture what's going on in a system post an actual event, a real life event in your chart. And you can see how what's our vision going forward. Where we want to take this. In future, we want to make sure that you can also add annotations and correlate with your real events like maintenance windows or new releases or production hot patch, and that way you can easily monitor what's going on. Either on a back in a day or a back over a week. Allows you to capture that on a single chart. You can easily add as many groups as you want. So groups allow you to actually capture different data sources and in different chart types. So in this example here, you can easily see how now you can monitor the number of errors and a different metrics such as your response times. So if you want, that gives you the powerful capability to kind of visualize and correlate your logs and metric data. So you can plot two different distinct metrics here and have different chart type on a single chart, and then identify what's going on, whether there's a spike in something, then like what are the logs in that time period. You can easily, once you have created this chart, you can easily add to a dashboard right from here. So, you can find the dashboard and save it and add it. Another thing that I would like to highlight quickly in this demo is the concept of a charts library. This is something that we have heard is a big win for our early adopters and all customers who have started using it. This gives you a complete overview of all the charts in your account. So you can see how here you can see your my charts, all the charts in the account that your teammates may have created. And you can see how this speeds up the whole process of visualizing and analyzing things. If you are a new employee in your in your company and you're still trying to figure out how to use Logly, or you don't know your own systems well, now if there's a power user who has already created charts, you can easily kind of just use them and get going. You don't have to worry about learning a new query language. You don't have to worry about creating charts. Just find those charts in the charts library, add them to a dashboard, and you can start troubleshooting. So what the easy way to do this is by to just check these multiple charts here, and then you can see this icon here. It says new dashboard with selected charts. I give it a name, and in one click I am able to create a dashboard with those specific charts. So this is useful for anybody you're onboarding Logly or your own team to kind of speed up. They can create their own dashboard. Finally, I would like to switch to the search page where this is the heart of our product. Almost everyone uses Logly's tool mainly for searching for their bugs or exceptions, and you can see how we have made it much more nicer and easier for you to actually navigate through the search page. You still have all the functionality and the power of the Logly search bar, and now it's much more visually cleaner and nicer to kind of navigate. Initially, we used to have something known as trends here at the bottom, which is our charts feature. Now we have put the charts tab on the top next to the event timeline. What this means is we have made it, and we have created a nice visual space on the top and a nice events viewer in the bottom, so that you can focus when it's the chart region, it's on the top, and then in the events at the bottom. You can easily collapse and expand regions. So once you create a chart and then you want to focus on your events, you don't have to worry about the chart occupying screen real estate. You can just zoom in and focus on your events, and then you can export it, as a CSV or a JSON, and you can do, if you want to do offline processing, you can do that. Finally, I would like to show you the new GitHub integration, which is what we previously talked about during the session. So here we have a quick app, just a sample app where, let's say this is a hotel reservation app and someone is trying to make a reservation. And when someone is trying to book, there's an exception thrown, and this exception is being sent to Logly. And here you can say, let's say if I was monitoring these exceptions in the system, I can look for, what are some of the exceptions happening. And I see a booking exception right here. Now, what we have done is that once you have connected your Logly account with GitHub, we show you an icon here right next to the source code file. So you're looking at a Django exception here, which has been nicely parsed. And there's a blue icon. If I click on this, it actually opens up the GitHub source code right inside Logly. You didn't have to switch between tools. You can actually see, what the source code is. It exactly points out which file, which line number. And then you also have the option to look at the file commit history. You can look at, who made these changes. In this case, it's me. I made a fool. And if I click on the yeah, and you can see that how then you can kind of diagnose this further by looking at all the changes that might have happened as part of this commit. If I click on this, it opens the whole thing in detail in GitHub. And now you have this complete workflow where you have decided that here's the offending line, that something needs to be changed and fixed. Now you can then continue along your workflow, where now if you see, you can also see, the ticket creating systems that have been integrated. In this case, Jira. If I click on this, I say create issue, we have a default template inside Jira. So you don't have to worry about filling out different fields. Once you create a default template, you can just fill it up and then you can give it a summary name saying exception during booking. And we include the event details and a permalink in the description, which makes it much easier. Like, we capture as much context as possible when we create the ticket in Jira, so that, if this is being shared across teams, and this is useful. You don't have to worry about copy pasting the event or the link. And you can see how this is useful for not just developers, but also others, like, support reps or QA teams, who may be actually trying, once they do their test cases or they're trying to reproduce a customer case, they find exactly what the issue is, and they can now capture this using Logly in a ticket with all the details, so that engineers can just jump in without having to worry about doing a lot of research. All the information is presented to them upfront, and that kind of makes them more productive as a team. So that creates an issue in Jira. So those are some of the, all the things that, we have in 3.0. Obviously, it has more features that, we can cover as part of a detailed walkthrough of the product. But some of the things I want to touch upon.
Great. Yeah. So just a plug for a more detailed webinar. We will continue with our Logly 3.0 webinars to, showcase all the features. So please stay tuned if you're interested in more features. And in the meantime, now we're open for Q&A. For the audience, please just feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A panel.
And while we wait for that, I just want to point out one thing. So in all the sort of examples we've given and most of the stuff that we've talked about, we've been talking about sort of troubleshooting and sort of monitoring in the abstract, I think. And that's sort of what most of our customers troubleshooting, is a very big use case for most of our customers. One of the things that good charts do, though, that is, perhaps overlooked, is it gives everyone a much better understanding of the overall system behavior over time. So this is particularly relevant to us because we care a lot about performance. And so all of our metrics on, system performance graphs over time let us see the impact of each new release. And obviously we try and improve performance with every release. But the point being that without that kind of overview of total system performance, it's often easy as an engineer to kind of rabbit hole on a specific issue. And I think that this going back to the gap that we talked about earlier between throwing stuff over the wall and whatever. This is one of those things where I think people who really care about how good a job they're doing as an engineer or as a DevOps person really appreciate the fact that you can get this really good overview that you can then drill down on and see exactly why it's behaving the way it's behaving over an extended period of time. And I think, we kind of gloss over that in the sense that, we talk about using this as a monitoring tool to detect problems. It's actually, if you kind of flip that around and say, okay, we don't care about problems. What we care about is sort of the long-term life of the system and how it's behaving in the normal state, right? That no problems. It's just performing at its current level. But we want to improve that. These charts, and particularly the time shift and annotations and stuff like that, give you the ability to really kind of grok the system in a way that is very difficult to do without this kind of data.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. You mentioned chart like time shift and I think there was an anomaly chart. Are there any more plans for any more of these chart types?
Yes. So as you can see, what we have with 3.0 is a foundation to keep building and adding features, not just like advanced visualizations like a heat map or a geographical map, but also more complex data editing controls. So right now we are just launched 3.0. We are trying to kind of focus on some of the immediate items, like improving the ability to share and improving the ability to kind of drill down into and inspect the log entries for when you look at a chart and you see a spike. Eventually, we'll get to those advanced visualizations.
That's great. And and there are some immediate items that we're going to address, right? After 3.0, can you talk about those as well?
Sure. So some of the immediate things that we are focusing right now are introducing some of the feature requests that are very popular. For example, the ability to inspect log entries when you look at a spike on a chart. So that was something that we had in a product, and we are kind of improving that and enhancing that capability. So that is something we expect to come soon. Another area that we are focusing on is making sure that the user experience around monitoring when you're looking at charts when there are a lot of data series is much better in terms of distinct colors and highlighting, so that you don't have to worry about like which line it is in 50 data series that stands out. Another area is a top values chart where think of it like those of you are familiar with our field explorer, putting it on a dashboard so you can easily look at quickly get a sense of here are the top values in the system, like number of errors or counts of some important metric. You can put it on a dashboard and keep monitoring that as a table chart. So that is something that we are going to introduce in the near term.
Mm-hmm. I see. And then I think we talked about the second y-axis and all those.
So second y-axis is an ask which is very popular, and that is something that will come soon too. That is right now we are still figuring out exactly when to introduce that, but that is also one of the more popular features that's going to come soon.
That's great. Yeah, it sounds like we have a full roadmap going forward.
So I think one of the other things that we often get asked is about the grid view. And so the grid view is, where you can actually look at the search results layout in a tabular format, and then you can add and remove columns to that table, and then you can either export it. So often we have heard from customers, whether you can add that to a dashboard. So yes, so we are kind of in going towards that in that direction where eventually you will be able to create these table charts, add them to a dashboard. just like you do a grid view on the search page.
That's great. Okay, so yeah, it sounds like we have a lot of things in place for our customers going forward, and our panelists. Again, thank you so much for joining our panel today, John and Pranay. Any wisdom for us? Any more wisdom? I know that we have talked a lot today.
I mean, I think the only thing I would say is that the best way to sort of understand the value of this is to use it. I think that, and don't think that you have to sort of boil the ocean on your first attempt. Even if you just start setting a few metrics, and start kind of seeing them, using the new charts and dashboards functionality, you'll kind of, something will click and you'll go, oh yeah, I really like this. And you can iterate and you can add more metrics and you can remove metrics that don't make sense. But don't think that you have to kind of solve, the grand unified theory of everything in your first dashboard. Just start using it.
That's great. Just start using it. I think that's the parting words. And then how about you, Pranay?
I think same here. The best way to find out is actually dig in, create an account if you haven't already. A trial account gives you access to all our enterprise features, so you can try out, not just our charts and dashboards, but our Jira and GitHub integration, our alerts features, which a lot of our customers use. We have introduced, a more like a statistical alert using standard deviations, which is also something that we have heard good things about. So the best way is to actually, log into the product and start using these new features. And if you don't have one, then sign up for a trial account.
That's great. And you're also getting feedback through a link, right, in the product.
Yeah. So the best way, to send feedback to us and is, there's a feedback button on the navigation bar inside the product. You can click on it. It sends an email to us, or you can directly send us an email at pm@loggly.com. It comes directly to me, and usually we are very proactive in responding to all, whether it's either, just a bug or an issue, or even like a feature request that someone wants to ask, we usually follow up immediately as soon as.
Great. Yeah, and I would encourage everyone to do that, because it really helps us and therefore you and therefore everyone else. We have a pretty robust internal feedback system where everyone in the company is sending Pranay feedback.
Wow. Yeah.
So and that, I think, has really helped us. I think that, Pranay obviously is totally on top of the flood of feedback from our customers as well. So, the more feedback we get, the better the product will be. And, that's why we're here, is to give you a better product. So,
definitely, we would definitely, our main goal is to give you a better product. So again, John and Pranay, thank you so much for joining today's panel, and Pranay for showing the Loggly 3.0 product. Today's session has been recorded, so we'll be sending our recording, in a follow-up email. And going forward, again, we will have a series of webinars, either detailing what 3.0 is or like some thought leadership topics. So please stay tuned. And again, thank you, and we look forward to talking to you again. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thanks.